What Patton said when a mother asked him why her son had to die, he had no answer. November 1944, somewhere in eastern France. The mud was ankle deep. It never dried. Not here. Not in November. Not when the war had turned this countryside into a graveyard that nobody had finished digging yet. General George S. Patton stood at the edge of a temporary command post. Canvas walls. A single lantern. Maps pinned with red lines that meant men were dying somewhere beyond those lines. He was the most feared commander in the United States Army. Maybe in the world. He had driven the Third Army across France at a speed that left the Germans breathless. His name alone moved soldiers. His name alone terrified enemies. Eisenhower used him like a weapon. Churchill spoke of him with reluctant awe. Hitler himself, reportedly called him the most dangerous man in the Allied forces. And yet, on this particular morning, a woman walked into his world. She had no rank, no uniform, no authority. She had traveled from Pennsylvania. She had taken trains. She had begged and borrowed and argued with military gatekeepers who told her she had no business being near a front. She didn't care. She had one question. She had carried it across an ocean. She had carried it through bureaucratic walls and military checkpoints and the indifferent machinery of wartime America. Her name is lost to most history books. But what she asked Patton, and what Patton could not answer, tells you everything about war that the history books refuse to say. Her son was dead. He had died in one of Patton's advances, and she wanted to know why. Imagine you were standing in that tent. Imagine you watched a general, a man who had memorized Sun Tzu, who had studied Napoleon, who had fought in 2 world wars, go silent. Completely silent. Not the silence of a man thinking. Not the silence of a man crafting his answer. The silence of a man who had just been handed a question that no amount of strategy could solve. That silence lasted longer than anyone in that tent expected. And in that silence, something true was revealed. Her son's name was Private First Class Thomas Hensley. He was 22 years old. He had grown up on a farm in western Pennsylvania. He had never seen Europe before the army showed it to him through the barrel of a rifle. He had written letters home, every week, without exception. Letters about the cold. Letters about the food. Letters about the strange beauty of French villages before the artillery turned them to dust. Letters that always ended the same way. Don't worry, Mom. I'm being careful. He died on a Tuesday. The advance had moved fast. Too fast, some would later argue. Patton's Third Army moved at a pace that outstripped supply lines. That outstripped reinforcements. That outstripped the ability of young men like Thomas, to process what was happening to them fast enough to survive it. Thomas was in a forward unit. They had taken a position. They were ordered to hold it. Reinforcements were promised. The reinforcements were delayed. The Germans counterattacked. Thomas Hensley died holding a position that was ultimately abandoned 3 days later. His mother knew some of this. She had pieced it together from other soldiers' letters, from whispers, from the brutal, incomplete language of military condolence telegrams. She knew enough. She walked into Patton's command post, and she looked him directly in the eyes. Why did my son have to die for ground you didn't keep? The room held its breath. Officers froze. Aides looked at their boots. Patton's personal staff, men who had watched him berate generals, curse at colonels, fire subordinates on the spot, had never seen anything like what happened next. Patton took off his helmet. He set it on the table. He looked at this woman, this ordinary woman, this mother from Pennsylvania with grief carved into every line of her face. And he said nothing, not for a long moment. When he finally spoke, accounts from witnesses differ slightly on the exact words, but the substance is agreed upon. He did not give her the speech. He did not give her the military justification. He did not tell her about the strategic necessity. He did not say her son's death had meaning in the grand architecture of the campaign. He said something closer to this. Ma'am, I don't have a good answer for you, and I'm not sure one exists. That was it. No flourish. No rhetoric. No Patton thunder. Just the truth. You have to understand what made this remarkable. This was a man who gave speeches that made soldiers weep and roar simultaneously. This was a man who stood in front of an American flag and told thousands of men that war was the greatest thing a human being could participate in. This was a man who genuinely believed that. Or thought he did, until a mother asked him to explain it to someone who had lost something irreplaceable. The ideology cracked. Not completely. Not permanently. But in that room, in that moment, it cracked. Here is what nobody tells you about George Patton. He was haunted. Not publicly. Never publicly. Public Patton was iron and fire and absolute certainty. Public Patton wore 2 ivory-handled revolvers and spoke in profanities and told men that glory was worth dying for. Private Patton wrote poetry. He wrote it constantly. About war. About death. About the souls of soldiers he believed had fought across centuries and civilizations, reincarnating into new bodies to fight again. He genuinely believed he had lived before, that he had stood at Carthage, that he had ridden with Alexander, that his soul was ancient and warrior-shaped. But the poetry wasn't triumphant. It was mournful. It was the poetry of a man who understood, at some cellular, inescapable level, that the thing he was most gifted at was also the thing that consumed human lives like fuel. He wrote about the faces of dead soldiers. He wrote about fields after battles. He wrote about the specific, unbearable silence that settles over a place where men have just finished dying. He was not oblivious. He was aware. Profoundly, torturously aware. And that awareness is what made the mother's question so devastating. Because here is the impossible position Patton lived in. He needed men to believe that their deaths had meaning. That was not cruelty. That was operational necessity. An army that believes it's dying for nothing cannot fight, cannot advance, cannot hold. The belief in meaning was the fuel that kept the machine moving. But the machine was consuming them. Thomas Hensley's death, the specific circumstances of it, raised questions that had no clean answer. Was the advance too fast? Patton himself had argued with his superiors about supply line support. He had known the risks. He had calculated them and judged the strategic momentum worth the cost. That calculation had a name attached to it. Thomas Hensley, PFC, age 22, Western Pennsylvania. Eisenhower had his own complicated relationship with Patton. He needed him. He was also terrified of him. Patton was the kind of commander who won by doing things that were technically indefensible until they worked. He was also the kind of commander who, when things didn't work, left young men in positions that couldn't be held. The political reality of the war demanded that commanders like Patton exist. The moral reality of the war demanded that someone answer for the consequences. Nobody in the chain of command wanted to be the one to reconcile those two realities. So they didn't. They left it to mothers in Pennsylvania to carry the weight of the unanswered question. Inside that command post, after his admission, Patton reportedly sat with the woman for nearly an hour. He did not defend himself. He asked her about Thomas. He asked about the farm. He asked about what Thomas wanted to do after the war. He asked about the letters. The woman, by multiple accounts from those present, talked. And Patton listened. Really listened. Not the performance of listening that powerful men sometimes deploy. He listened. One aide later wrote that he had never seen Patton look older than he did in that hour. Not older in age, older in understanding. The war ended. Patton didn't get the ending he wanted. He wanted to keep going. He wanted to push into Russia. He said so, too loudly, too often. He believed the West was making a catastrophic mistake by stopping at the borders it stopped at. History has complicated opinions on whether he was right. He was relieved of command. He died in December 1945. A car accident. In Germany, the man who had survived 2 world wars, who had ridden horses into combat, who had lived on the edge of death for decades, was killed in a non-combat car accident months after the fighting stopped. Some people have always found that suspicious. The official record says it wasn't, but Patton had made powerful enemies. He had said things that embarrassed the Allied command. He had spoken about the Russians in ways that directly contradicted official policy. He was a problem, and then he stopped being a problem. Make of that what you will. The mother, Thomas Hensley's mother, returned to Pennsylvania. She lived another 19 years. She never spoke publicly about her meeting with Patton. Not once. The account we have comes from 2 aides who were present and wrote about it years later in separate memoirs. Memoirs that were published quietly, that didn't make bestseller lists, that sat in the margins of the official history. History loves its official version. The official version of Patton is the helmet and the flag and the speech and the Third Army thundering across France. The unofficial version is a general sitting quietly with a grieving mother, asking about a dead boy's farm, having no answer for why the boy was gone. Both versions are true. That's the thing about history. The official version doesn't cancel the unofficial one. They exist simultaneously. They demand to be held simultaneously, even when that's uncomfortable. There is a particular document from the Army's records, declassified decades later, that contains internal assessments of casualties during Patton's Third Army campaigns. The language is clinical. Casualty rates, advance rates, comparative analysis with other commands. The conclusion, buried in the bureaucratic language, essentially says that Patton's methods produced both exceptional gains and exceptional losses. Exceptional losses. That phrase is doing enormous work. Inside exceptional losses is Thomas Hensley. Inside exceptional losses are the letters that stopped coming. Inside exceptional losses are the mothers who made journeys to command posts to ask questions that generals couldn't answer. The document runs to 47 pages. Thomas Hensley gets no pages. He gets a number in a column. Here is what this story refuses to let you do. It refuses to let you choose a simple side. If you condemn Patton entirely, you erase the reality that his speed and aggression shortened the war. That every month the war shortened meant thousands of other Thomases who came home. The calculus of war is genuinely horrific. The brutal truth is that commanders who minimize casualties in individual engagements sometimes extend wars and therefore produce more total casualties. It is entirely possible, not certain but possible, that Patton's relentless advance saved more lives than it took. But tell that to Thomas's mother. Tell it to her face. Look her in the eyes, those eyes that had read every letter, those eyes that had carried hope across an ocean, and tell her that her son's death was an acceptable variable in a statistical argument about aggregate wartime mortality. You can't do it, and neither could Patton. That's the legacy. Not the Third Army, not the advance across France, not the ivory revolvers or the speeches or the Hollywood depictions. The legacy is a general sitting across from a mother. Helmet off. No answer available. No rhetoric sufficient. No ideology capable of filling the space between the question she asked and the silence where the answer should have been. That moment is more honest about war than almost anything written in the official histories, because it shows you that the people who prosecute wars, even the most capable, most brilliant, most legendary among them, are ultimately doing something for which no complete moral accounting exists. They make decisions. The decisions have costs. The costs have names. And when someone shows up and says the name out loud in a voice that is not asking for strategy but for meaning, the machine goes quiet. Patton reportedly said one thing as the mother was leaving. One thing beyond the hour of listening. He said, "He was owed more than I could give him." That sentence should be carved somewhere. Not on a monument to victory. On something smaller. Something honest. Because it is the most truthful thing a general ever said about what war actually costs. Not in territory, not in strategic positioning, not in the cold language of military doctrine, but in the currency that can never be repaid or replaced. A boy who wanted to come home. A mother who deserved an answer. A general who had none. The war machine moves forward. It always moves forward. It does not stop to explain itself. It leaves the explaining to the silences between the official records. It leaves the explaining to the moments that don't make it into the speeches. It leaves the explaining to us. And so I'm leaving it with you. George Patton was simultaneously one of the greatest military commanders in American history, and a man who could not justify to a single grieving mother the cost of one of his advances. Both of those things are true at the same time. So here is the question that I need you to answer in the comments below. When a nation sends its sons and daughters to war, and those young men and women die, who is actually responsible for answering the question of why? Is it the general who gave the order? The president who declared the war? The politicians who funded it? The citizens who supported it? The ideology that demanded it? Or is the honest answer that nobody answers that question because answering it would make war impossible? Tell me what you think, because Thomas Hensley's mother asked it in 1944, and nobody has answered it yet.